Hello, everybody. This is Aziz Yasri from the University Mohammed VI Polytechnic of Ben Gurion. And today we have a new webinar in this webinar series in biotechnology and agriculture. Like you know now, this webinar series were developed within the movement for solidarity for Africa. And this is our contribution to this movement of solidarity of Africa. So today, I have another researcher from the African Plant Nutrition Institute, Dr. Thomas Oberthûr. And Thomas Oberthûr, like I said, is coming from this the African Plant Nutrition Institute, and he will elaborate in about 45 minutes about one of the topic in plant nutrition, which is perennial crops and the potential and risks. So before we get in, I would like first to thank you for your participations. There is so many different people coming from different countries. I know that some people are watching this live webinar where it is now morning, and some of them are watching the same webinar where it is the evening or in the afternoon. So good morning for the ones, and good afternoon and good evening for the others. Thank you again for your participation. So this webinar series were developed in collaboration with our partners, RUFORUM Network, OCP-Africa, and African Plant Nutrition Institute, from who we are hosting today Professor Thomas Oberthûr for a webinar series in perennial crops. So we will have this talk about 45 minutes, and like you know, there will be a session of question and answers. So please hold your questions until the end of the talk of Professor Thomas Oberthûr, and then we can go for some of the questions. I'm sorry, we cannot have all the questions. There's so many questions each session, but Thomas Oberthûr will try to answer the majority of them. But before we start, and before I introduce you to Professor Thomas Oberthûr, we would like to hear a little bit, Thomas, about African Plant Nutrition Institute. So I know that it is located now, headquartered in Morocco, but what is the main missions of this institute?
Well, thank you, Aziz, first of all, and hello to everyone, wherever you are based. It's a pleasure to be with you. Well, as you may know or may not yet know, the African Plant Nutrition is a relatively new organization. It was founded in 2019. Actually, however, on a fairly long history, because it grew out of the International Plant Nutrition Institute, which in itself has several decades of legacy and of research and development and crop nutrition. So being a relatively new institution, so we are still developing really our mission and vision, but there seems to be a strong consensus both internally and externally that really we see the mission of this new institution in using improved plant nutrition for a food and for a resilient, in terms of climate change, for a resilient and food secure Africa, if I may put it into one line. And really we see us as APNI, short for African Plant Nutrition Institute, as an organization which contributes to an Africa in which plant nutrition makes significant contribution to the reduction of poverty, of hunger, and most importantly also, equally important, helps to reduce malnutrition.
Thank you, Thomas, for this overview about the African Plant Nutrition Institute. By the way, we are working with this institution, colleagues from the research programs at the University Mohammed VI Polytechnic.
Yeah.
We're in close collaboration with you guys. Thank you for that. So the other question I have: how many today? How many antennae you have in terms of localizations in Africa?
Yeah, well, as I said, we are fortunate that APNI is being built on the heritage of the International Plant Nutrition Institute in Africa. And as such, we actually can count on the physical infrastructure which had developed over years in Africa for the International Plant Nutrition Institute. And as such, we, as you already mentioned, we have a headquarter in Morocco, and to be precise, in Ben Guerir. But we also have a second office within Morocco itself in Setat. But a part of that, using the previously developed APNI infrastructure, we do have a physical base in West Africa, in Yamoussoukro in Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire. And we do have a physical office infrastructure as well in East Africa, namely in Nairobi in Kenya. Currently, we have about a permanent staff base of just over 20. We are in the process of actively recruiting more staff. So hopefully over the next 2 to 3 years, we will see significant growth in staff. But apart from, I think one of the strengths, apart from the permanent staff base I mentioned, is that, again, building on what the International Plant Nutrition Institute had already developed, we can count on an extremely strong partner network. And you already mentioned the close collaboration with UM6P, but there's a network with numerous partners across the African continent. Linked to that is another network of contributors and advisors which support that relatively modest team of 20 plus permanent staff, and thereby lead to that impact which really stretches across quite a good part of a continent.
Thank you, Thomas. One information that's helpful for the participants to know. What are the biggest today? What are the biggest projects you are working on in these sub-Saharan countries?
Well, I mean, rather than going through the individual projects, it might be of more relevance to the listeners just to understand the main research structure. And currently we are looking at, or we are developing research under 3 different pillars. The first pillar is, how do we use plant nutrition with benefit in an era of climate change? And not only of climate change, also of extreme weather patterns, which tend to happen over much shorter time spans and aren't as gradual as climate change. So that's our first theme, developing plant nutrition that contributes to resilient systems in an era of climate change. The second theme is one we are particularly excited about. I mean, we are excited about all, but the second one is a novel theme we want to develop, which really pertains to the issue of how can we, through responsible nutrition, build up soil health that in turn contributes to improved livelihoods. And that can be through different ways, by improving soil health directly. But we also envision to use soil health as a catalyst, which then supports the development of differentiated products, qualities of which can then be traced through the crops, from the soil, through the crop, to the crops, through the animals, to actually the human participant in the food chain. And thirdly, so these are two relatively new themes we developed, and all of these is being channeled towards, you may call it the core business of APNI, which is precise nutrient management. So we are taking the output of the two novel themes, developing it into processes and methods for a more precise management of crop nutrients. And under each of these themes, we have several projects which are partly just beginning, and some of them are actually legacy projects coming from APNI into the fold of APNI, the African Plant Nutrition Institute.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, if you have just joined us, I have the pleasure today to host Professor Thomas Oberthûr from the African Plant Nutrition Institute for a webinar. So, so you haven't missed yet the talk. We were just discussing with Thomas about the institution he's coming from, which is the African Plant Nutrition Institute, the role it is playing in the plant nutrition sector, and in particular, and in agriculture in general, in some sub-Saharian countries, and also the project they are contracting in this with some partnership in these countries. So, so before I hand the floor to Thomas for starting the talk, starting the webinar, I would like to introduce him to you. So, Dr. Thomas Oberthûr is Director for Business and Partner Development for the African Plant Nutrition Institute in Morocco. He is currently responsible, has his current responsibilities focus on identifying research and development programs that support natural resource and systems management. Also in agricultural market development, including inclusive engagement with high-value crop supply chains, agronomy, and current management. So as you can see, he is a very important man for research. Thomas, a native of Germany, has spent his professional career working for leading research organizations across Asia and South of America. He received his PhD degree at the University of Western Australia. He has directed successful programs with organizations such as the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, ACIAR in Borneo, Eco Agriculture Partners, and the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, CIAT, in South America. Prior to joining the African Plant Nutrition Institute, Oberthûr headed the Southeast Asia program for the International Plant Institute based in Malaysia. So, really a great pleasure to have you, Thomas, for this webinar, which is part of a series of webinars, and I will hand it to you for your talk, and your talk will be followed by question and answers. For the participants, please hold your questions until the end of the talk, which will last in about 45 minutes. Okay, the floor is yours, Thomas.
Well, thank you very much, Aziz. Let me just start my presentation first. Well, again, welcome to those who just joined in the last 2 or 3 minutes. It's a pleasure to be here with you, or it's a pleasure to be remotely with you, I should rather say. And it's equally makes me equally happy to have been asked to talk about the topic which is very close to my professional heart, that of the topic of tree crops. And I do hope that all of those of you for who's already evening or late evening, equally so for those which just got up in the morning. I've been asked to talk about 45 minutes, so it's going to be a long talk. I've got about 50 odd slides to go through, but I hope that my passion for this particular topic, tree crops, will carry you through, and hopefully I can share a little bit of that passion with you. So really the question of the talk today is, how can we have a research and development, or how can we have research and development efforts in crop nutrition for tree crops that truly benefit farmers? And I have structured my talk in a fairly straightforward manner, just into three simple sections. The first one introduces a little bit the issues in tree crops, which are, as we will see, slightly different, or actually very different, than a number of issues in annual crops. Then I introduce a few opportunities of how R&D in crop nutrition can benefit growers of tree crops. And here I have to say, because in the introduction you heard APNI is a relatively young organization, I will use some examples which have, or which had been realized by teams with who I used to work before my time in APNI. But our aim, of course, is to repeat and even to expand these kind of examples under the new umbrella of APNI. And that brings me then to my third component, where I'd like to introduce an admittedly just emerging APNI platform for R&D in tree crops. So with that, let's jump into the first section of issues and particular elements of tree crops. And first of all, tree crops are perennial crops. They grow over several years, which kind of sounds trivial, but it has non-trivial implications. And the most important one is most definitely that fruit development in tree crops can happen, or does happen, over a fairly long period. And here I show you the example of oil palm, where a 2 millimeter small bud develops into a fully sized fruit bunch over 3 years, sometimes even longer. Cacao crop, 9 months, similar coffee, etc. So we are looking at a period which requires quite a different operational and logistical setup than comparable research in annual crops. And it requires patience, and it requires commitment, and most of all, it requires long-term resource allocation, which is not so common nowadays, as you probably would agree with me about. Now, the second aspect is similar. This is a shot most of you are very familiar with. It shows how a trial on station, or in this particular case on farm, on crop nutrition, can be a rather complex trial, can be embedded within one single individual field. In this particular case, maize systems with 7 or 8 treatments in a fairly modestly sized field. Now, in tree crops, that picture would look very different. I mean, here we are talking about planting distances of 7 by 7, 9 by 9, etc. meters. In this particular case, you see a young oil palm field where you may have 130 to 135 trees per hectare. I mean, if you're looking at North Africa, argan is a very famous crop, a signature crop for Morocco, we are looking at 100 trees or even less per hectare. Even in more commercial tree crops like coffee, cocoa, you may have anywhere from 800 to 1,500 trees per hectare. This is nothing compared to your 50,000 to 70,000 plants in a typical annual crop on a per hectare base. Now, on top of, as if that wouldn't be enough, on top of it, tree crop systems have the characteristic that there's often an extremely high intra-tree variability, very often phenotypic plasticity. So again, posing challenges for research and development to actually operationalize effective research in the field. Now, if that wouldn't be enough compared to annual crops, very often annual crops, as we all know, can receive support from public funds, third-party funding, because they are essential for food security very often. So that leads to the fact, or this led to the fact that in terms of the knowledge base established, tree crop systems in general lag way behind the research knowledge base which we have established in the last couple of decades for annual crops. So there are really tremendous gaps to be filled, particularly so in crop nutrition research and development. And even in the best research crop amongst the tree crops, which clearly is oil palm, depicted here in a graphic taken from Corley and Tinker, even in a relatively well-researched tree crop like oil palm, we have gaping knowledge gaps, particularly relating to the root system and their role in nutrient access, nutrient recycling, etc. And with respect to knowledge about the role of a trunk, of a stem within the whole tree physiology, and particularly so within the whole aspect of, or the whole domain of nutrient cycling. If you were to search for knowledge on root systems, if you find anything at all, you are likely to find information like this, which is simulated on computer models, very little real data, and the knowledge base is even thinner as far as the role of a trunk goes. We're really only scratching the surface. I mean, this gentleman is actually going under the surface, but we are really only scratching the surface with our understanding of the role of a trunk within the overall nutrient management system. So if we package these issues, or if we use these issues to frame the perspective of a farmer, and we were to ask, and if we were to ask a farmer, how attractive crop nutrition in tree crops is compared to the other major inputs into a farming system, and how sure he or she is that she would get back benefits from a tree crop. And if we compare it then with, say, with fuel as an input, or with planting material as an input, you can bet your hat on that nutrients are consistently being ranked lowest in terms of generating benefits to those who use it. So the return on investment in nutrient use is indeed highly uncertain. And farmers are operating in an environment of uncertainty, particularly if it comes to nutrient management. Now, if we envision crop nutrition R&D to truly support farmers, we gotta understand what they are faced with, what their uncertain environment the makeup of that uncertain environment. I like to use a classification developed already in 1994 by Mr. Rao, published in Risk Analysis, titled Understanding Uncertainty. And he breaks down the whole complex of uncertainty in 4 manageable components. And the first one is what he calls the metric uncertainty, about the precision of input. And that essentially, the classic example is how many kg or gram of nutrients do I apply per unit area or per tree, right? It's the common, more known question. Now, secondly, there's temporal uncertainty, and here it gets already more tricky. Temporal uncertainty obviously is related to past and or future events. So what's the impact of last month's storm on nutrient availability? What is the likely impact of this year's drought on nutrient availability? All questions which are extremely difficult to answer. Now, thirdly, there's structural uncertainty. Structural uncertainty is actually related to factors, to internal factors, which are different from the crop I'm going to manage. So that little picture shows you, for example, a coffee crop under shade trees, intercropped on top of it with plantains. So how do the shade trees and the intercrop impact on my coffee nutrient management? Is there competition? Are there synergistic effects, etc.? Are there catalytic effects? Very little we know about. And thirdly, there's translational uncertainty, and that is where farmers are often most concerned about. And that is uncertainty related to factors which are actually originating outside of your cropping system, mainly coming from the markets. What are the prices going to be in a year when I'm going to harvest my cocoa beans, or in 2 years when I'm going to harvest my fruits from my oil palm? So if we were to ask farmers how they perceive these kind of components of the uncertainty and which one they consider most risky, they usually would say temporal, translational are perceived with the highest risk, followed by structural, and lowest usually with metric uncertainty. Now the problem comes if we juxtapose that, or if we compare with the limited research which has been done for tree crops. By far, most of the research has been done or was related to metric uncertainty, rates, and similar. Now, exactly in the areas where farmers feel relatively comfortable of actually dealing with it, very little research has been dedicated to aspects of temporal uncertainty, and probably even, no, not probably, and even less to aspects of structural and translational uncertainty. And this is nicely captured in my last slide in that first section. We recently drove to the Essaouira region in Morocco on the coast. And here's an olive field. It's a fairly large size grove managed by a group of farmers. Now, as it happens, on the right-hand side, researchers managed metric uncertainty. They trialed different rate applications and source applications and similar. Climate was extremely variable, and you can see the result under those conditions in the trees. And whereas on the other side, a group of farmers essentially managed structural uncertainty by pooling resources, putting in localized irrigation systems for intercrops, which in turn then benefited the tree crops. So a very different way of looking at managing these highly variable conditions. And if we want to make a difference with R&D in tree crop systems, we have to consider this kind of setting. Which brings me to my next section, so where I'd like to introduce just a few examples demonstrating that there are actually plenty of R&D opportunities, which can often lead in a fairly straightforward manner to benefits of farmers and growers in the field. And as I said, and I apologize for that, we are just as APNI building up our tree crop portfolio. So I'm just picking 2 or 3 examples from previous work, one from South America and 2 from Asia. And the first one is with cacao. Having said this, that this comes from Asia, from Indonesia, it could have been realized the same way in Ghana, same way in Cote d'Ivoire or in Cameroon for that matter. But here we specifically deal with temporal uncertainty. And I'll show you that example with the results of a trial we conducted with about 100 farms over 5 years in 4 different farmer groups. And the simple comparison we made was good agricultural practices, GAP, without fertilizer compared to good agricultural practices with fertilizers, right? So we had 4 groups. They all started at different times. July 2013, second group in January 2014, July 2014, both of these groups started in July 2014. Each group has about 25 to 30 farmers, full on-farm design. As I said, farms were split in 2 halves, 1 fertilizer and GAP, 1 no fertilizer GAP. I show you the results for 2 years, and we look at the results in terms of tons of dry beans per hectare, right? The red line in each of the 4 plots represents more or less the average of the region. Somewhere fluctuating, depends on the year, between 300 kilograms and 400 kilograms of dry beans of cacao per hectare, right? So the first thing which is common across all 4 plots and quite obvious is that the light gray colored boxes or results always outperform the dark gray boxes. And the light gray is with fertilizer, the dark gray is without fertilizer. And in fact, in these 2 groups, you can see that in the second year, that outperformance actually grows. And that is what we expected, right? And it generated such advantages that also financially, in a cost-benefit analysis, these 2 groups over the 2 years truly reaped a quite significant benefit from using external nutrients in their systems. Now, but look down here, group 3 and group 4. I remind you, they started later. We still see that fertilizer applied fields outperform those without fertilizer, but as you can see, the actual results are coming very close, or in fact are falling under the local average. It is obvious that under such situations, these farmers in both groups experienced heavy losses, which were further accentuated and increased by using external nutrition, because they have to pay for it. So what happened? Essentially, El Nino happened. In 2014 to 15, stretching into 2016, we had the second strongest El Nino in that part of the world within the last 25 years or so. Now that made us think, how can we, under such difficult conditions, still support crop nutrition in cacao? And that's where we started a follow-up analysis, trying to bring together or trying to identify a manageable and actionable relationship between El Nino and the response of a crop to external nutrient input. So the way we did it, we had data, as I mentioned earlier, crop production data from July 2013 until October 2018, more or less 5 years. Of course, El Nino data are publicly available. There are different sources. We downloaded ENSO particular from the NASA website, reformatted the data so that we could use them within within artificial intelligence packages. But the interesting feature is you can see over that 5 years, we had 3 different El Nino situations or ENSO situations. We had La Nina, which is a negative ENSO signal. We had neutral in black here, where the values fluctuate around 0, and we have strong, highly positive values given here in red, which represent El Nino situation. And as you can see, right in the middle of that phase, where groups 3 and 4 started, we had a super peak of El Nino. Now, what we did, we dissected the data set we had, actually across the whole 5 years, but I show you only just to illustrate the idea. 2 examples, we had the data set just prior to El Nino peak, and we had a data set post El Nino peak. We developed some artificial intelligence algorithm in order to understand the relationships between the production and the performance of a system and the nature of the ENSO signals. And I can only show you 2 examples because this is being currently reviewed, so I have to be a bit careful how much I bring into the light at this point. But I think these two shots of results are telling a pretty clear story. So what we see in this graph here is essentially you have the unfertilized yield down here. Unfertilized yields down here. You have a fertilized yields here. You have a 1-to-1 line, meaning if your points are on the line, there's no advantage from external nutrition. If they're under the line, obviously you are losing out. The unfertilized fields are performing better than the fertilized yields. And in this particular case, you can see that all the points are sort of clustered along the 1-to-1 line, telling us there's really no advantage in terms of using external nutrients, more so since the farmer has to pay for. If he were to turn that into financial return, that would be clearly a negative return. And that happened if one applies nutrients, external nutrients, at a period just before and around the peak of the ENSO signals. If you were to apply the same amount of nutrients under neutral ENSO conditions, this is where nutrients really come into play, and you can see how significantly the points moved away from the 1-to-1 line, coming out in favor of using external nutrients under these kind of climate conditions. Now, the important point here to keep in mind is that El Nino data can be forecasted now, are available for up to 18 months forecast. The cacao nutrient management period we are looking is roughly a year. So we have 18 months forecast. We have a year where we want to manage our nutrients in. You can see the tremendous potential of this kind of analysis to develop management approaches which work and which support and benefit the farmers. Now, the second example I'd like to introduce to you, let me just check my time here, I'm still good, is from oil palm. And here we are dealing mainly with structural uncertainty. If you recall the oil palm fruit development, I mentioned it earlier, from over more than 3 years, 37, 38, 9 months from the bud to the crop. And the important point here is during various moments in this trajectory, nutrient and water stress will have an impact. And we need to take them into account. Now, unfortunately, we are looking at 3 years, right? So in one particular field, in one particular year or 3, can therefore have no dry period, nor excess of water. In other words, it's normal. We term that situation N. But it can have a dry period, but no wet period. So we term that D. But it can also have no dry period, but a wet period, in any particular moment. And as often happens within 1 year, you can have a dry period and an excessive wet period. So we call that situation extreme. What is compounding the issue is that it's not only the rain and the sun which impacts on the crop. Recall that hilly picture early on, high variability, large areas for tree crops. Topography takes on an extremely important mediating factor. And of course, finally, your tree density, your different soil horizons will further modify the picture. Now our theory was, okay, if firstly, each field harvest event is characterized in terms of non-controllable production factors, rain, topography, soil horizons, from 3 different consecutive years. And if secondly, if a large number of field harvest events is classified into sets with similar non-controllable production factors, then it should be possible to understand crop response to management within a particular set of non-controllable factors. Now that sounds a little bit convoluted, but it becomes quite straightforward. So these characterization of fields which experienced similar conditions over 3 years or in a given year, but driven by that particular year and the 2 preceding years, we term homologous events, if you can filter them out. That's exactly what we did. And here I show you an example for 2013. So these homologous events are influenced by the conditions in 2013, 2012, and 2011. And we group those fields which had similar conditions, shown here with different color coding. So these are about 6,000 hectares we are looking at, about 150 individual fields, all grouped into different homologous events. And now we can analyze the response to crop management within each of these event types. Now the issue, however, is that the very same field, classified in this case 4 years later, looks very different. While here, the types or the categories were mainly drought and extreme driven. Here we had events. But it gives us the handle to look at the impact of management under, including crop nutrition, under different homologous events of non-controllable factors. And now let's just put this into context. If we compare homologous events that had 2 years before the harvest, normal conditions, so all those fields which had no drought and no flooding, if we compare the yield under these conditions with yield in fields 2 years before the harvest with dry conditions, homologous events 2 years before the harvest with that conditions, and homologous events with 2 years before the harvest which experienced extreme conditions, so had drought and flooding within 1 year, then we have a loss of 6 tons of fresh fruit bunches per hectare per year compared to normal conditions, just over 5 tons under the wet conditions, and a whopping 8.5 tons of losses in fields compared to the normal fields where we had both drought and flooding. Now again, just to put that into perspective, 8 tons of fruits over 2,000 hectares contain close to 50 tons of nitrogen, 6,000 kg of phosphate, and more than 60 tons of potassium. Essentially, if we don't take these highly variable conditions into account, these are nutrients lost. This is money lost that had been invested into nutrients, again explaining the low return on investment. Now I'm going to speed up a little bit. My last example comes from coffee. The situation here is very different. Here we were looking not at yield performance, but at inherent quality, because it captures quite a significant price premium today in the market if your coffee quality is high. Now, the nice thing with, so usually we would say the inherent quality, the same as yield, is driven by an interaction, obviously, of genetic material, by environment, by management. More often than not, in a perennial crop, in a tree crop, the genetic and the environment are fixed because you have already planted, and environment is non-controllable. So the only controllable factor is management. And that's what we were trying to do in this particular case. We wanted to identify what are the relationships between quality, fixed genetic material, fixed environment, so that we could alter management to come to a better quality. I'll show you an example from Colombia, particular from those two departments, Cauca and Nariño. There was a certain baseline information available already, core and enabling information. But we went into the field, we sampled each field for coffee samples, processed them in the field, put them into near-infrared analysis, fed them further into sensorial tasting, then again used statistical approaches to identify the relationships between management, between management and the given variety, and in this particular case, topography. And you can see very clear patterns. In this particular case, I show you the probability of beans produced in Cauca and Nariño to have high acidity, a key feature in coffee quality, which is being paid for, and high flavor content, equally important in the other map. So you can see clear patterns. So once identified, they become manageable. In fact, they became so far manageable that the Colombian Coffee Federation today has registered at the European Union 7, I show you 6 here, but there are 7 by now, regional denominations for coffee qualities, which are driven by these interactions. And for each denomination of a region, obviously, you can get a premium. Now here I just show you an example of what are the key factors which are driving this kind of interaction. And we concluded in a recent book, based on a lot of these research, we concluded that our current understanding of a relationship between applied nutrients from inorganic and organic sources and the intrinsic coffee quality, you could substitute tea or cacao here for coffee, is incomplete at best. And this clearly remains one of the most significant opportunities for research to add value to the coffee industry, in particular to the growers. Now, this brings me to my last section. So if there are these truly tangible opportunities there, how can we benefit from them, and how can we operationalize a tree crop program? And as I said, we at APNI, a relatively young organization, are just about to start to scratch our heads, not only ours, also those of our partners, and hopefully yours too in the near future, how we can develop a tree crop program. Now, the first is, of course, you saw it before, we have to address the imbalance in what matters for growers and what used to matter for researchers, right? Usually, researchers like metric uncertainty because we can deal with individual factors, which for a number of reasons is much easier. Right? You can isolate factors, control the others, and then just deal with one. We have to focus on here in order to get the balance right. And that really has to do with using value chain approaches, using systems approaches, and using modeling approaches. But to me, this is really the only way to become farmer-centric and farmer-supportive. And what is extremely critical, if you really want to break out of the science domain and reach the applied domain, the knowledge we produce has to have certain key characteristics in order to become relevant for ultimate beneficiaries. It's got to be credible. We know that. Most of our research has been credible. That relates to the scientific adequacy of technical evidence. But it's got to be relevant for the decision maker, which in this particular case, obviously, is the farmer who grows tree crops. And equally importantly, the generation of that knowledge, which we envision to change farmers' management, has to be produced in a legitimate, meaning in a respectful, fair, and inclusive generation. Only if we address these three parameters with our R&D, will we see impact in the field. Now that of course has certain implications for how do we structure our research, right? We can just compare the three potential pathways: routine farmer experimentation, scientist-driven on-farm experimentation, and true farmer-driven on-farm experimentation. Now a farmer experiments of course all the time, right? Because they are curious. They want to try something, then observe. And sometimes they even measure. And then if the result was as they expected, they change. Now, so it's a simple, cheap, and easy, and most importantly, highly meaningful approach to experimentation for the farmer. But you can't really generalize that. You can't take it from field 1 to field 2. And more so, it's uncontrolled. Now compare that with a farmers-driven on-farm experimentation approach, where the farmer hosts an experiment that is of interest to the scientists. The strengths, of course, are that there are clear goals of experimentation with clear designs. However, usually, because it's centered on metric uncertainty very often, or more often than not, it's just a partial representation of a system, and it does not necessarily address the issue of relevance to the one we want to change its management, right? So on the other hand, a farmer-driven on-farm experimentation is where a farmer requests an experiment to test one or several inputs of interest. Now they are pragmatic, directly transferable to the system at the same scale. They may have low semantic content, and therefore need interpreting for generalized insight to transfer it elsewhere, right? This was kind of the base thinking on which we are now designing the APNI tree crop platform. All right, so it would all start in the way that we see APNI as an incubator and process manager, which along the supply chain articulates market demand and off-takers demand, channels that into an on-farm experimentation innovation hub. So research is really conducted here on-farm based on what's relevant to the farmer and for what there is opportunity and potential in the market. Now, once this is systematically done, that enables us to bring agribusiness input providers on stream. Recall the last slide where I said that very often research conducted in that way needs to be interpreted That we do by way of having benchmark systems that can be on station or at lead farms. That can be done by systems modeling that helps to put this research being done here into context. That almost surely guarantees adoption because the backup is here, and it enables in a systematic way existing extension and advisory service to play a role. And more so, it complements ongoing conventional controlled experiments on breeding and plant nutrition on station. Opportunities and options generated here can now be filtered through and brought into a very systematic experimentation process into the agricultural system. Now, we have already earlier developed a process for that, which is, I call it the infamous horse race track. It's an 8-step process of engagement, which starts here with dialogue in the field. There's a section on data management, and there's a key section here at that part of the process again, where all is about analysis and interpretation together with growers. And then there's a review step and a repetition. Most importantly, that kind of research, because you take into account the value chain perspective, can have, will have, and must have a business model oriented design. Now, and for tree crops, obviously, this becomes even more critical, as we have a wonderful situation that in tree crops, we can react, or with tree crops, we can react to a multitude of different market signals. It could be about yield improvement. That is our classical intensification pathway. I just show you here the example for olive, where we are currently looking into this situation. But at the same time, the market could all be about diversification. So you have a intercropped olive with, for example, fodder crops or pasture. The market may honor this. You may also be having signals which guide you into a management that fosters and strengthens product differentiation, higher quality olive oil versus lower quality olive oil. And finally, there are now more and more market signals and markets which honor environmentally friendly management. So I mentioned earlier the root system. We haven't understood the role, for example, in carbon sequestration, and more so what nutrition can do to support such use of root growth and for carbon sequestration, and then feed into markets that pay for environmental services. So a multitude of opportunities, but it needs a very specific setup in tree crops to benefit from this. I promise to be within 45 minutes. I'm close, so I'm jumping over my last 5 sets, which do not contribute much more, and end my talk right here. In case we can't go through all the questions or different questions should emerge later, my contact is here. We would really appreciate comments and even potential interest of developing with us such a tree crop program for the African continent. And with that, I temporarily shut up.
Thank you, Professor Thomas, for this really interesting topic that is treating the issues of perennial crops, risks and potentials. So for the people who joined probably at the middle of the talk of Professor Thomas Oberthûr, so you can still watch it from the beginning, because this webinar is recorded and it will be broadcasted at the end of this webinar. It will be broadcasted through the channel, so you can still see it and you can still watch it from the beginning, and you will have all the different details that were given by the speaker. So now, like I said, today I have the pleasure to have and to host Professor Thomas Oberthûr. He is from African Plant Nutrition Institute, and now we're getting to the question and answer session. So this one, it is from Professor Tanji Abbas. So he's thanking you, Thomas, for the presentation. And he's asking, do you have any research about olive tree, citrus, and date tree nutrition? Because they are the major tree crops in Morocco.
Hello, Dr. Abbas. That's a very straightforward question, which I can answer in an equally straightforward way. We do have some research going on in citrus and date, which is, earlier I mentioned we have some legacy projects which originated in the time of the International Plant Nutrition Institute, and particularly so the citrus and the date research has or have their origin during that time, and they are still going on for another 2 or 3 years, I believe. Likewise, I think in a similar program, we have some research also still going on in olive. Most of that, I think with all 3 crops, it's related to the generation of the most adequate nutrient recommendations in these particular crops. Having said this, we are actually seeing at least 2 or 3 of these also as priority candidates for us to grow our program. So we do have something going on, but it's got a fixed time stamp to it. It will come to an end, but it's our intention to actually develop a much larger program on precisely those 3 crops, particularly with a geographic focus on North Africa. So we welcome, if you write to me, I'm happy to link you with the researchers who are conducting the ongoing research. They will be happy to share any information they have at hand. But myself, I'm very interested in actually finding potential partners for those very crops you mentioned.
Thank you, Thomas. We have a question from Abdelatif Botagay. He's thanking you for the webinar. He said that agroforestry is a very important system, but how this practice can improve the yield of perennial crops, and what is his advantages for pest and soil nutrient management?
That's I think we could talk about for hours just about this particular question, but yes. it's also I mean, there's certainly, if I look at the last part of a question, right, what are the advantages for pest and soil nutrient management? No one probably in a sane mind would question that there are advantages for pest and soil nutrient management, not only for pest and soil nutrient management, for water management, equally important as well, right? But I couldn't give you a specific answer right now, because in terms of quantifying impacts on yield, because these tend to be highly location specific and highly situation specific. And there's a multitude of different interactions between the different components of the system. And this is precisely the reason why I tried to introduce earlier a research approach which goes away from a single factor focus, but looks at the overall system in order to understand that complexity. Now, more so, I just concluded my talk with highlighting that tree crops offer different, sometimes even bundled revenue streams. Only one of that revenue stream is from yield. So if I would give an answer, or if I would highlight the importance of that question, really lies in the understanding of how can I benefit from the different interactions between 2 or 3 components of an agroforestry system in order to answer or to respond to market signals, and how in return, or how as a function of that understanding, can I then tweak my management accordingly. So sometimes I will forego yield but improve quality. Take the cacao coffee shade system. We know that shade in that cropping systems is reducing yield. Again, how much percentage that is depends on where you are and what exactly your shade regime looks like. But it's reducing yield in a given year. But firstly, it's extending your productive period quite significantly. In cacao, for example, from 12 to 25 years, right? But more importantly, we haven't even started to realize that you can use that very shade vegetation, which suppresses yield. You can systematically use it to improve quality. And the gains being made through that pathway may be in fact higher than those from the actual yield performance. Similar, you can guide your water management accordingly. But these are questions you can't really give a straight one-shot answer. What I'd like to see is actually a research setup that enables farming communities within a value chain context to take the market signals and then trial and experiment in a systematic way in response to those market signals. So then really the role for us as researchers becomes one of setting such a system up and develop the protocols and the analytical measures in order to interpret together with our partners in the field the outcomes of these kind of trials. So that was a rather long-winded answer to a fairly short but very complex question. Yes. Hello,
From
Mr.
Idrissa Noah.
Yes, hello, Idrissa. We have done, and we have specifically done that, at least as far as my own experience goes. We have done that in coffee, we have done that in oil palm, and we have done it most recently in cacao. And within, particular for the cacao work, you will find within the presentation there should be a reference where part of that work also has been published. And I'm happy if you drop me an email. I'm happy to share that material with you. And also, similar to the previous question, there's no sharp answer. There's no black and white in this case. No, I'm in the presentation. I had 4 farming groups in cacao, 50 farms. The first, 50 farms in the first 2 groups. Most of them had a positive economic return to using external nutrients, which came at a fairly high cost component. Now, the other 2 groups actually experienced significant losses, even though they were in the same region as the previous 2 groups, but they started somewhat later. They were unfortunate in the sense that they got hit by ENSO. So their economic feasibility of using external nutrients essentially flip-flopped within 2 seasons. But yes, whatever I have, if you drop me a line, I can share with you. And I'm pretty sure these kind of situations are very common in any tree crop you have. Because they are growing over this long time period, you are bound to experience environmental shocks, not to talk about market shocks that we have at the moment. I do know a lot from my previous engagement in the coffee industry, I do know that plenty of supply chains broke down. So all the investments made into nutrition half year later because of the COVID forced impacts on supply chains have been done in vain. So the immediate yield is one factor, but how is this being placed in this risky environment where tree crop farmers operate is a totally different set of questions.
Thank you, Thomas. I just want to say that at the end of the presentation of Professor Thomas Oberthûr, he gave his contact information, and you can I can show it to you now here, because I can see. Probably not now, I'm sorry. Just, if you go to the video at the end of the talk, the last slide contains all the information of Professor Thomas Oberthûr with his email. And if you would like any kind of data or related to your questions, you can write him an email, and he will answer, like he said. Okay, so we have now a question from Nguni Shirinda. He's thanking you for the very insightful presentation. And he's saying, are you also considering silvopastoral systems in the new APNI program on tree crops?
Thank you, Nguni. The very short answer is yes. The somewhat longer answer would be, I initially introduced, even before I started my webinar, I introduced the 3 main pillars where APNI will engage. And one pillar was, if you recall, that was the pillar of the research focusing on soil health and livelihoods. And particularly in that research pillar, we envision a very strong role also for silvopastoral systems. Now, I couldn't tell you exactly what kind of systems, at this point of time, I couldn't tell you exactly what kind of systems specifically we may include, because the development of that work is really just starting, and it is essentially demand driven. So the agenda will be set through a consultative partnership program. And as it happened just this morning, we had initiated a working group which is precisely looking into some of these aspects. So a resounding yes. But I can't quantify exactly, or can't tell you exactly which specific system will be part of the future research.
So we have a question now from Professor Hassan Bouksim. Professor Hassan Bouksim is from the University Mohammed VI Polytechnic, and he's also from the private sector because he's heading a company in France. So he's thanking you for the interesting talk. His question, he said, concerned the taking into account of ecosystem services in the evaluation of economic returns from agricultural production.
Thanks, Professor. I'm not entirely sure what the specific question is. I certainly agree with you that the opportunity for ecosystem services is tremendously large. but it's also tremendously, I'm not sure how whether your work actually concerns that topic, but for sure you are familiar with some aspects, otherwise you wouldn't ask that question. The potential is tremendously large, I believe, but it's a complex issue, and it's got to do, in my humble opinion, it's got to do as much with physical research on the components of a system, be it nutrition, be it crop economy. It has to do equally much with research into socioeconomics of a system, and particularly with moving the research away from the plot to the landscape. Because as soon as we start about ecosystem services, and more so about starting to talk about generating returns from ecosystem services, we got to look at landscapes. Now, landscapes bring in a different dimension of institutional management. We got to move away from the one farm, one field focus to questions of institutional design, questions of benefit sharing, and it's got to be a supply chain focus for sure. But I personally believe this is a field which we have seen. I mean, there was a lot of enthusiasm. I remember I used to work for a think tank many years back, which precisely focused on this aspect of environmental services. And that was in the 2007, 8, 9, 10. There was a lot of enthusiasm to develop the field, but it hasn't really moved ahead. We have made advances as far as carbon services go. We have made some advances as far as service provision or payment schemes related to services for water are concerned. Better upstream agronomy management for better water quality downstream. But a lot of aspects, particularly those related to nutrition, are still at very, very early stages. Now, I always look at that issue of nutrient export. If you fertilize up your hill, your neighbor down the hill will certainly benefit from that over time. Now, how we can quantify that, and more so how we can monetize that, is a very different question. But I agree with you, there is plenty of potential, which I hope we can build into the APNI portfolio. So maybe one day come over and we sit together and discuss that.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question from another question from Ahmed bin Hammou.
Yeah.
Thank you for the important presentation. He said, do you include a cost benefits dimension on your research? Of course.
Again, yes, and that's why I actually concluded my talk with this kind of R&D's got to be built on a business model approach, bringing in the supply chain. I mean, I did a few minutes ago, I cited that example of cacao growers we worked with in Indonesia. You got to bring this in, otherwise it doesn't make sense. And more so because with tree crops now, it's a relatively straightforward function. I mean, relatively straightforward function, forgive me. In annual crops, you have your yield component, that's what you monetize, and you have your cost structure in order to realize that. But in the tree crops, I mentioned it earlier various times, you have different potential income streams. But each individual potential income stream has its own set of cost structure. So in order not to run the tree against the tree, basically you have to very carefully bring in a cost benefit dimension. Absolutely.
Thank you, Thomas. This is a question from a student, master degree, fertilizer science and technology, Buya Samuel, from Uganda. He said, thank you for the presentation. And he said, what are the agroforestry tree species very technical question. Huh? What are the agroforestry tree species best suits the cereal cropping systems of smallholder farmers, and how could they possibly be introduced?
Thank you, Mr. Boer-Samuel, for this very difficult question, and I'm honest enough to say I can't give you a straightforward answer on that. For a number of reasons. First, that goes beyond my current knowledge simply. Whatever the most suited tree species in cereal cropping systems. But it also is, I suspect it will also be a decision which has to look at your geographical niche. It has to look at, well, first, what are your main cereals? I guess in many places we are looking at probably at maize systems, perhaps with some emerging rice systems. Frankly, if I would tell you something right now, I wouldn't feel comfortable with that at all. I wouldn't even know how to build it in at the moment. You have, of course, different design options. Now you have border options. You have also within field options, probably depending again on the state of mechanization of your cereal system. And the other, I think, key question, which brings us then closer to a possible answer, is probably the fact, what would you envision as the main driver of a system, both environmentally as well as economically? Will it be the cereal system, or will it be potentially the tree system? So again, that would have an impact, pardon, on how to design such a system. But I have to pass here. I wouldn't be able. We can conceptually approach it, but I wouldn't be able to give you species number 1 or 2 for a specific cereal cropping system. But I'm happy to explore. Very happy.
I have a question from Krishna Devkota. Again, another professor from University Mohammed VI Polytechnic.
Yeah.
He's from the Azari, which is the new antenna of the university in south of Morocco, Laayoune. So he said good presentation, and he's asking, do you have any example of productivity declining of perennial crops over time due to decline in soil fertility?
Hello, Professor Krishna. Yes, I have, but at the same time, I need to highlight that the very same system exposed to a slightly different management can actually reverse these trends. Specifically, and in fact, I'm not sure if I mentioned it in my presentation, but if not, I can send you that. We had 2 or 3 years back, one of the first publications looking into oil palm systems with specifically that question in mind, SOC, because most intensively managed oil palm systems, at least as far as Asia goes and South America, where my expertise comes from, is usually being associated with a decline in soil organic carbon. And a handful of publications is actually showing that. Now, if you were to, into the same system, if you were to build in a good agricultural management scheme or best management practice scheme, which obviously comes at a cost, we were just discussing that, then you can actually reverse these kind of trends. And we have published from our own work such an example that over a relatively short period, as far as perennial crops go, in this particular case, we monitored data over 4 years, you could actually reverse soil organic carbon situation from a net loss to a quite significant net gain, which was almost at the brink to push that system into a position that through that extensive root growth you could participate in carbon trading schemes. So a number of systems can go either way depending on your management, and that goes back to one of the previous, or the answer to that issue, of course, lies in the previous questions, where one participant asked for cost benefit. So you got to filter that in. Best management practices can increase SOC, and for that matter, different soil quality parameters as well. You can get improved pH values either way, up or down, and you can improve. You can have improved cation households, but it really depends on your management scheme, and each management scheme is being tied obviously to a certain cost structure. So no straightforward answer here. You can guide that into either direction. Shade trees are a key component in that puzzle as well. In that puzzle as well.
Okay, so we have a question from Vincent Migba. Sorry, he's thanking you of the R&D crop nutrition presentation. And he said that they are currently developing new fertilizer formulation for cocoa and oil palm in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And he's asking, what is your stake on the fertilizer formulations?
That is a that's a very challenging question, but a very good one, Vincent. We have worked on that for quite a while as well, and some of the not some, all the trials actually. I mentioned in the presentation in cacao, but also earlier work in coffee, were focused on generating at least some insights into how formulations could look like. And our basic entry points were actually nutrient removals with the harvested product. So we developed our entry points really based on nutrient content analysis of the harvested product. We built in certain factors for losses in the system, which you unfortunately have to estimate. But the key component is really how much is being removed with a production, and that obviously crop to crop. Take oil palm, for example. You have heavy removals of potassium, which you got to replace, and so your formulations got to reflect that. In cocoa, it depends significantly on how you intend to manage the husk. The husk itself, I mean, the whole fruit obviously contains, for example, plenty of potassium and nitrogen. But if you then separate the husk component from the actual beans, that proportion changes drastically, right? And then it depends. So there's much more K in the husk than there's in the actual beans. And then it depends on your husk management. Do you export it? Do you use it for different purposes, etc.? But yeah, the key to all is what the amount, what is being envisioned to be produced, being harvested, and then how is the harvested material being used? Is it completely being exported out of a system, or is it remaining in the system? Having said this, and I alluded to that component very early on, there's still one factor which, to my knowledge, has no answer yet, and that is the role of a trunk in tree crops. So we need an annual supply of nutrients, which goes obviously beyond the normal maintenance dose, right? You gotta make sure that growth is being adequately covered as well. And that, of course, depends on your growth dynamics over time, and until that equilibrium after a few years. And that we would not have sufficient knowledge, to my understanding, what that means in terms of formulation. But we can more or less fairly well define, at least roughly, how a formulation should look like. And I'm happy to send you some of our initial calculations in that regard. But it's all, let me repeat that, it's all driven, it's plant driven, more than soil driven, although the soils plays a factor, but it's mainly export driven.
Okay, as we are heading toward the end of this very interesting talk and webinar, so if you allow me, Thomas, I'll take only three, four questions. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, I whatever you say, yes.
Thank you. So I don't want to have take more time than. So we have a question from Rida Ben Mreed. He's saying that he's based on the pedoclimatic factors and the plant genotypes. Can we develop a model to predict the nutritional needs of tree crops?
Thanks, Reda. Another very tricky question. My first answer would be no, it wouldn't be sufficient, because a lot of that is modified, if you recall the oil palm model, a lot of that is modified by conditions which probably go beyond pedoclimatic factors. You got to have into your model, I think you need to have modifiers which describe the topography. If you are on an extremely flat domain, maybe you could, but I would be a little bit skeptic to base nutritional needs simply on genotype and pedoclimatic factors. I would probably want to see, at least to a certain degree, topography being built in, and that could be quite straightforward in terms of simple qualifiers as to where you are on the position in your topo sequence.
So now we have a question from Dr. Mohammed Luay. Thank you for the presentation. Do you think that tree nutrition can cover for some of the yield losses caused by drought in water-limited areas and some innovative land use systems?
Again, this is a topic. Thank you, Mohammed, first of all, for that question. To me, that is a classical topic which I'd like to see being trialed and tested under location-specific on-farm experimentation approaches. Because at this point of time, we do know certain aspects of tree crop systems. We do know that nutrition generally helps them, proper nutrition generally helps them to overcome water stress periods. And not so much in terms of reduced losses in the particular harvest, but more so in terms of supporting faster recovery and therefore being in a position for the next, in a better position for the next harvest. So my general answer, and you obviously qualified it through innovative land use systems, would be it can definitely reduce some of the losses, not necessarily in the actual harvest, but very likely in the following one or some in oil palm, for example, even in the following 2 harvests, if you fertilize during a just before or just after a drought situation, that will have long-term impacts. Now, whether these increased yields fully recover your expenses for your nutrition, that needs to be then looked at in a cost-benefit analysis. So again, it's finding the right balance, and depending on your location-specific situation, you probably will have you will need a combination of external simulation and internal experimentation to really find that balance. But in principle, a clear yes.
Thank you, Thomas. We have a second question from Vincent Adrim Mikpa. His second question is that based on your experience and expertise, can we have a research network within the continent on crop nutrition aspects of tree crops?
Well, let me answer you like this, Vincent. If there wouldn't be a chance to have it, I wouldn't have joined APNI. So, so yes, I hope we can have one. And it's one of my responsibilities and one of my ambitions to actually help setting one up. Clearly, because I see a multitude of potential benefits coming from tree crops, not just for farmers, also from an environmental point of view, that I think it would be foolish for us as researchers to not consider that opportunity. Now, how extensive and how large we can grow such a network, I can't clearly say, but yes, we must have one with different elements. We internally, for example, looking at the potential of establishing a network of long-term trials. We are looking at the potential of developing farmer networks who experiment in a systematic way. We are trying to connect with NGOs and with industry to really build that platform. So I have to answer yes. I cannot say no right now. That would be against all reason. I developed this webinar, and I hope get in touch with us. We are looking for partners in that endeavor.
Thank you, Thomas. Just before giving you the last question of the webinar, so I would like first to just summarize much of the comments that has been sent through the the chat part of the webinar. Many people are thanking you of the opportunity for sharing your thought and also your work in this domain, and for the nice presentation. Some of the people said really enjoyed the presentation. So this is tells me that I have to re-invite you again down the road.
If it's not next week, you are welcome.
Okay, not next week because we have other speakers.
I know.
Down the road, probably to come back with some topics in plant nutrition. Thank you very much. So my last question, I'm just summarizing questions. We have a lot of students following your presentations and your webinar and the work you have showed, and questions related to if there is any still PhD subjects that they can still dig in today in this topic, which is perennial crops, and trees, and plant nutrition for trees. What could be the high priority for you? High priority.
Well, it depends really where the interest of that person lies. There's several key aspects I could immediately name. If that someone is really into the say classical biophysical component, I'd love to see more studies on root systems. Root systems in nutritional management. We know virtually nothing. Well, we know something, but very, very little. what particularly we had a few moments to discuss about aspects of tree crop systems in the context of environmental services. Understanding the root system will be important for performance, the classical performance, yield performance, but it will be important for the contribution of tree crop systems to environmental services, both carbon household, water household. Similar, I mentioned it earlier in my talk, as far as crop nutrition goes, the trunk is very poorly understood from different aspects, from the physiology and how the nutrients play a role in that. Also in simple terms of nutrient demands, it's very little understood. Related to both, there's a whole component of methodological aspects. And how do I measure that? The tree crops, you can always harvest the subplot of wheat. You take out the square meter and you analyze it. If you go into a hectare of coffee or a hectare of oil palm and you take out a tree, that represents a quite significant loss. So there are methodological aspects in how to actually take these measurements. Remote sensing comes into play. So someone interested in that aspect. Then there's the whole component, again, how do we operationalize? So it really depends on the interests of particular students, but there's the other component of how do we operationalize research on tree crops. That has to do with experimental designs, involvement of the community, institutional setups required to deal with these very specific components, with these very specific aspects, long time periods of tree crops. And thirdly, maybe I'd like to mention, from a very pragmatic point of view, farmers or growers of tree crops often struggle tremendously in the immature period of trees, which can stretch. I mean, take argan in Morocco. We are developing an argan program, or project, sorry, I should say, at the moment. We look at 7-8 years without income. So how do we build systems through intercropping, through different measures that help farmers to take that step into tree crops in a relatively, I don't want to say risk-free, but at least where risk can be more or less reduced and controlled. So to me, these are three very important aspects, depending on the interest of particular students. Each is equally important.
Okay.
There's a lot to do. There's a lot to do.
I know, but it's at least the students got some. Thank you very much again, Thomas, for coming today and for this having elaborated on this very interesting topic that you are, undertaking at the African Plant Nutrition Institute. Thanks for your time. And really, before I move on to introduce our next speaker, I would like to give you the last words for closing up.
Thank you, Aziz. I think that's the first time I've been asked for the last word in a presentation. No, it was a pleasure to be here. And what was exciting, looking at the question, I mean, just at those questions which were placed or which were given to me here, it attests to a very good understanding of the issues. A lot of questions pertain to the complexity of the systems, and a lot of questions pertain to the economic viability of the systems. And these are really, and it makes me happy to get questions of this kind of nature. Even some I couldn't answer because they're too complex for me. But these 2 points, that people, if listeners, if the audience is on the same wavelength with me on issues of complexity, and really that these systems have to be economically viable, that makes me fairly confident and optimistic that we are on the right track. So thank you for the opportunity. And as I said earlier, my contacts were there. We are looking for partners to develop this. Get in touch with us.
Thank you, Thomas. On my name and the name of the ESAFE team, the name of OCP-Africa and RUFORUM partners, would like again to thank you for your time and for the topic that you have elaborated on. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Professor Shami. I'm sorry, we have, Professor Shami Zingor, okay? And he will be elaborating on a very interesting topic again, which is spatiotemporal spatiotemporal patterns in maize nutrient responses and their implications for fertilizer recommendations in smallholder farming systems. This webinar by Professor Shami Zingor will be next Thursday. I will not be chairing the next one, but it will be Professor Mohammed Boulief from the School of ESAFE that will be chairing one. So I will be delighted to have you next Thursday at 2 p.m. time in Morocco, which is GMT +1 time zone. So thank you very much for participation. Before I close up again, and since we have students watching this presentation, I would like to inform you that we have at the School of Agriculture at University Mohammed VI Polytechnic, we have recruiting students for our master degree, Fertilizer Science and Technology, which is in relation with the topic that you have just learned about, plant nutrition. So if you would like, if you have a bachelor degree or engineering degree, you can apply for this master degree by sending a request to this email over here, esaf@um6p.ma, or through the discussion using this phone number in WhatsApp. At that phone number, you will have Mr. Ismail Ghorbal, one of our coordinators of this master degree, that will answer all your questions. So you are welcome to apply for this master degree. It is a unique one, and of course, the University Mohammed VI Polytechnic is providing scholarship for coming to study at the university. Thank you again for your time. Thank you for your presentation, and I will see you next Thursday at 2 p.m. this week. Bye-bye. Thanks, Thomas. Thank you again. Bye-bye.